Hello and welcome to another Back to Jerusalem podcast. I'm Eugene Bach and I'm your host for this time. And I'm coming to you live on delay from somewhere within the borders of Sweden. I'm super excited about this podcast. One we've never done before. This is a podcast that I'm calling Mail Time. So for all of you haters that have been writing on our social media, sending us the most hateful emails, I have invited you several times to come and join our podcast. And some of you are absolute cowards and you won't come and join me on the podcast to address your concerns. So we're going to address your concerns in your absence. I feel that this is going to be us wading through a bunch of crap I'm putting on my waiters to address all you haters. Stephanie, so great that you can join us. You've been running our social media now for a couple of weeks and you have been sending me messages almost on a daily basis saying, hey, how do I answer this person?
Yes, I'm sorry. But I would say that for every 10 positive messages, there's maybe one hateful message. So I wouldn't say the majority are the haters. So I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, I maybe I think of the haters because those are the ones that you usually have to answer, right? And I feel really bad just because you are the nicest person I've ever met. I don't think I've ever seen you when you're not smiling. Even there were times in Dubai, that's the first time I saw you face to face was in Dubai. You guys weren't always feeling well. There was a time I think you were sick or jet lagged. Your husband,
I had vertigo.
Paul, you had vertigo. And you're like, I have vertigo. Like with a big smile. It was, I mean, you always are in a good mood. Like you're always joyful. I don't know.
You should ask my husband that question. He would say otherwise. But thank you. I try to be positive, but no, you should. We'll hang out a little more, and you'll see the real side.
Well, I see some of the people
and I think the only messages I do send you are the bad ones. So I feel bad for that.
And I feel bad for you. I'm like, here's this nice, sweet person who's volunteering to answer social media posts for B2J. And then some I don't know if it's like nanny state Christians or just angry, pessimistic believers, whatever. They just come across like barking and biting and just a little bit vile sometimes in their response. And I feel like that's not fair. It's not fair to you. So I kind of want to jump in there and say, okay, let's go. Let's do this. I will take you on mano a mano, but nobody wants to come on our podcast.
That's good. Yes. Well, and I think from my side of things too is it's kind of what people are hearing. It's misinformation, a lot of it. So for those that haven't spent a lot of time in this arena, maybe like you have, I really appreciate hearing your perspective, hearing your side of things, because, I mean, I'm a mom of 4. I'm not constantly in the current events or now more so than ever because I'm working on the social media side of Back to Jerusalem's website. But for the average person who's just living their life, we don't, maybe we're not like in the thick of it. We're not boots on the ground like you are. So when you hear other perspectives popping up, it's nice to have a resource. It's very nice to have a resource like Back to Jerusalem, that if a Christian worldview, that you're really involved in the world outside of the United States. And so I've really appreciated that. I've learned a lot. It's opened my eyes a lot. Just a great perspective that you bring to the table. So appreciate that.
I think that some of the questions that you have are legitimate questions, to be fair. I mean, there are people that, they might come across maybe as a little prickly, but it's just maybe my perception rather than the reality. And because my perception is not always reality, I've asked Bethany from our UK office to also join us because sometimes she helps keep balance. Her and I have been working together for several years, and she has a different way of looking at things. So we kind of bark at each other from time to time, but there is a balance there. So good to have you with us, Bethany.
Well, because I always feel like, for the most part, Stephanie, you'll probably agree. For the most part, with people like this...
You see how she does that? She already starts with, Stephanie, you will probably agree. Like already, like blocking me from the conversation by establishing her dominance.
I'm right, but I'm going to let you pretend that you can disagree if you like. The thing is, most of the time, these people are not worth engaging with. And fighting with them does not achieve anything other than making Eugene feel better about engaging with them. But I do think that if there are legitimate questions, or if people are saying things that are not true, I think then there's definitely grounds to kind of challenge that and say, hold on a minute, that's not the case. So in that instance, I think that can be productive.
Yeah, I do agree with that. I think that I think it's okay to question. I think a lot of these people have questions that I've had myself, but you're right about there's a way to go about it. And I think especially if you're a Christian, I have seen both sides in the social media realm of, Christians that approach something and respond in a very respectful way. But then I've seen, non-Christians and Christians alike that have responded very demeaning or belittling. And I don't think, and disrespectful, I don't think that's called for. I mean, even if people are saying something that you completely disagree with or is completely untrue, we can still have a very respectful conversation and discuss and have a dialogue. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think we should be doing that. We should be prepared to give an answer and to do it in kindness and in love, but it doesn't have to be the definition of what a lot of people are calling tolerance is to just side with what you disagree with. And I don't think that we should be doing that. I think that we should stand up for what we believe is biblically true, but we should be able to do it in a way with, love and compassion and kindness.
I completely agree.
So
and
be on your best behavior, Eugene.
Yeah.
Do we need a buzzword? Do we need something that I can say when you're drifting off into it? So
no, I think that it's fair. I mean, you may not agree with this, Bethany, but for me, I think that it's fair to say that I can be pretty strong and somewhat, I can listen with people that disagree. I like to talk with people that disagree, but there's not too many positions that I'm not willing to bend on if I'm presented with evidence where I'm wrong.
I agree.
I actually love to listen to people that make a good argument against me in a nice way. I don't like to listen to people that come on full on attack me, because then I'm already on my guard, and I really would like it to be physical rather than at some point. Anyway, so mail call, Stephanie. Please, the very first one.
Sure, let's start off easy.
Mail time.
Mail time, yes. Mail time. Is that M-A-L-E or M-I-L?
We'll never know. Okay, so we'll start easy, which I guess you can define this as easy or not. And this is in response to an article that was called Burn Your Boats: What Dedication and Sacrifice Looks Like on the Mission Field. And honestly, I think that this is just an opportunity for you to maybe explain what Back to Jerusalem is. So it's a good question. He says, Back to Jerusalem. The Zionists wouldn't like that. But for people whose ancestors never stepped foot there except during the Crusades, such as the Europeans who had Christianity forced on them by the Roman Empire, or other Christians the world over who have had that religion forced upon them, what does it mean to go back? It sounds a lot like the Zionist movement, where some Europeans with no ties whatsoever to that land and who adopted a religion that was explicitly not intended for them and that they didn't understand decided to quotes, go back there. We know how that is going. So there's a lot in there.
Yeah, there is. So let me just kind of back up a little bit and kind of share what this person is getting at, because they're going down a road that we like to use in America and Europe and talk about, well, we didn't actually have to deal with this problem before the Europeans stepped foot in the Middle East and started, making all these problems. So what they like to do is they like to point to the Crusades as being a bad word, an evil concept, a time that Christians need to repent for. So if you're listening to this and you're a Christian that's been in a university history class at any time at all, or high school or even elementary, your children or anybody that you know that's going through today's modern education in Western Europe or the Western world, you're going to hear how evil the Crusades were. And I'm not going to defend those Crusades. So what they are saying is this idea Back to Jerusalem is a Zionist movement. And by calling it Zionist, they're obviously trying to connect it with some sort of idea of colonialism. Colonialism being linked exclusively to Europe and America, in some ways America. That it was only the Europeans that colonized. It was only the Europeans that went into the Middle East and declared war using the Crusades. Now, let me start off by saying this with the Crusades. The Crusades were nothing that I would defend as they turned out. There was more than one crusade, and the crusades, the longer they progressed, the longer they went on, the worse they got. And there were individuals that were coming into the crusades, and they were stealing land from Muslims. They were stealing land from the people that they were invading. They were raping, they were pillaging, they were killing. They were doing things that requires true repentance by believers, because they were being done by those that did so in the name of Christ. They carried a cross. They often had a cross on their armor. They often had a cross on their banner. They often had a cross on their shields. However, this is what we all want to not say. This is what Western history books will not say. And that is, Christianity was being attacked by Muslims for 700 years at least. Muhammad, when he came into power around the 6th century AD, he immediately went into the offense, attacking Christian countries, Christian people, Christian lands, and they had to convert or be killed. Their women were raped, the people were killed, the villages were pillaged, the people were made into slaves, and they were done that way for 700 years. To put that in perspective, America has not even been a country for 300 years. So the Christian world went through this for over twice the amount of time that America has even been a country before the first crusade. So before they even responded, before they did anything, they just kept taking it and taking it and taking it until finally the Muslims, because what they did was they took over the entire Middle East, moved into Syria and Turkey, which were Christian nations, Constantinople, which was a Christian capital. They raided and sacked Constantinople. If you ever go there to modern day Istanbul and study what they did, it was horrific. You do not want to imagine what would have happened if you were a woman with children in Constantinople when the Muslims came and invaded, for no reason, by the way. They only invaded for one single reason, and that is the belief that Muhammad wanted them to take over the entire world. From Constantinople down into Africa, they took over all of northern Africa, completely kicked out Christianity. You had Christianity really solid and heavy in both the Northwest as well as the Northeast. So, I mean, you had the Bible schools in Alexandria and modern day Egypt, and those were the most popular. And in fact, today we even say Coptic Christians when we refer to Christians from Egypt. Why? Because Coptic means common. Almost every Egyptian was Christian. It was considered to be common for Egyptians to be Christian. That's not the case anymore. Now they're a very, very small minority being heavily, heavily persecuted. Then you have like St. Augustine's hometown in northern Africa that was taken over by the Muslims. And then the Muslims started moving in. They took over Sicily, they took over Italy, and then they moved into Spain and Portugal, took over Spain and Portugal, and then they started moving into France. That's when it stopped. That's when the Crusades kicked in, and they're like, no more. We cannot allow all of Europe basically to be taken over by the Muslims, which is what was happening. That's why the Crusades started. So I believe that the Crusades were started for a good reason and necessary reason, and we like to pretend it was for no reason at all. That was patience. Patience like a statue. 700 years, are you kidding me? I wouldn't wait 7 days before I'd want to launch a counterattack. 700 years. And finally the Christians fought back. That's a very broad brush. I'm not saying that that's accurate history. That's pretty much history. Then we get into the Zionist movement. Okay, the Zionist movement is this idea that the Palestinians' homeland is being taken over by the Israelis, and the Israelis are coming in as these occupiers, as these colonialists, to take land that's not theirs. That's simply not true. Jordan actually owned most of this land that is current day Palestine, or what we call Palestine, as well as Israel. And the people that lived there, the people that were there, that was a part of the Muslim groups that kind of marched in There was occupation of the Roman Empire over this area that we call Palestine, and they did govern over it, but not and after the Muslims came and conquered and took over. And by the way, none of us here in this conversation or any of our listeners would have ever been able to visit Jerusalem or go into any of the old sites of Jerusalem while it was under the occupation of the Muslims. It was the Israelis that came in after World War II that were given a home. Israel was not a part of their home, but immediately after they arrived, there was a coalition of nations that went in and attacked Israel while they were in their infancy. And out of miraculous events, we had an Israel that was able to beat 5 countries that were also supported by the EU, the UN, and many Western nations. So you had Iraq, you had Syria, you had Egypt, you had Jordan, you had all these nations that were coming in and supporting this complete eradication of this newfound country called Israel. Israel finally went in. We have the 7-Day War. We have the War of Yom Kippur. Both of those wars ended up Israel taking land that was not a part of the original agreement, but they did so. Why? Because that was the staging area for the attacks that were on them. So in order to take over the places that were hitting them, that were the main staging areas, they ended up taking Jerusalem. Then they ended up taking a lot of areas that we now consider to be Palestine, which is the Gaza Strip, and Golan Heights, these areas, which is a big deal. And people say, well, this is occupation of Israel over foreign lands. I simply don't agree with it, and for those reasons. Sorry, I went off on a tangent there. Bethany, what say you?
I think that was a very measured and rational response.
Woo! Look at that, victory!
You get an A+ for that one.
Nice. I have no notes in front of me. I have no notes. I didn't know this was coming. This is me, my wine, my mind. Let's go.
It's good. I think the one thing though that maybe you need to inform people who I don't think this person follows Back to Jerusalem is that Back to Jerusalem is also the vision for Chinese missionaries to take the gospel from China back to Jerusalem. So he was kind of on a premise that he didn't really understand the vision of Back to Jerusalem.
That's a really good point. I'm glad you went back to that, because there could be an understanding from him and others that maybe it's this idea that Christians will go and occupy Israel. Christians will go and occupy Jerusalem. We have no desire to occupy Israel. We have no desire of occupying Jerusalem. We believe that the gospel started with Jesus telling the disciples after his resurrection to go and tell the world that he is the one that gives eternal life. And in Acts chapter 1, he sends out the disciples, and they go in a westward direction from there. We see that in Acts chapter 1, where the disciples leave from Mount of Olives down into Jerusalem. We see this in Acts chapter 10, where Peter goes all the way to Joppa, which is the westernmost part of Israel. We see this in the transition from chapter 10 onwards in Acts up to chapter 16, where Paul gets all the way to the western part of Turkey, and he tries to go eastward, tries to go northward, but he's stopped by the Spirit of Jesus and the Holy Spirit, and then he's led westward into Europe. The idea Back to Jerusalem is that continuing wave westward that starts in Jerusalem, and we believe spiritually, not a physical occupation, but a spiritual revelation will go like a tidal wave around the world. And in fact, the Crusades did exactly the opposite, which is the Crusades was an armed resistance that went eastward from west to east. That's one of the things that I think made it extremely I don't want to say profitable, unproductive. Made it extremely unproductive. It's because it was an eastward movement, which means that had to be forced, which means that people had to take weapons, because people did have this idea that we're going to re-Christianize the areas that were taken by the Muslims, and we're going to go all the way back to Jerusalem from a west to east movement. And the only way you do that is by going against the Spirit, which means that you have to do things the way the enemy does things, which is by force and fear and death, threat of death. That's how Islam spreads. Islam spreads by force because it's a lie. Spreads by fear and threat of death. So Back to Jerusalem is a spiritual movement where people decide whether they want to receive Jesus or not. This is not an occupation movement of Christians going and buying property in the West Bank and setting up residence and trying to push out the Jews or the Muslims and make Jerusalem a Christian city or Israel a Christian nation.
Very good. Okay, so these next set of questions really revolve around the theme that Christianity is not persecuted. So,
that hurts. That hurts.
Okay. I'll start with two that are kind of similar.
Okay.
This person says, Christianity is the largest religion in the world. It has the most influence by far. Also, Sunday, Easter, Christmas are recognized as federal holidays by the U.S. government. The Supreme Court is made up of a majority of Christians. There is no way Christianity is persecuted in most parts of the world. Okay, so there's one, and this one's similar, so I'll read it as well. How are Christians persecuted in the U.S.? Specific examples, please. These churches are on every corner, benefit from tax-free status, and the government is not forcing them to close. How are these experiences similar to places where people are imprisoned for their beliefs? Why is the American church claiming to be victims when they are the most free in the world?
What article was that on, Stephanie?
So that was actually just a response to an advertisement for our Voices of the Persecuted Church conference. So it wasn't tied to any article. And there are two more responses that were tied to the article and really questioning the persecution of Christians. This guy is interesting. He says any persecution is coming from among themselves. With more than 1,000 different denominations, they can't get along with each other, let alone with people of different religions. And then the last one's kind of prickly. He says, Christians are not, all in capital letters, persecuted in this country. That's, and I say baloney. He used a different word. That's baloney. As a matter of fact, we're on the verge of being ruled by an authoritarian theocracy.
Okay, so
there's some questions there.
I think that that his argument for the U.S. is one that is a little bit more opinionated. So whether there's persecution in the U.S., I can make an argument for there being persecution. He can make an equal argument for there not being persecution. When looking at America, when looking at the U.K., I know that you're in the U.K., Bethany. Would you say that he's right when he says that there's no persecution against Christians in the U.K.?
Yes, but I know a lot of Christians that would disagree with me. But my opinion is we're not. And to me, it gets a little bit self-pitying when I hear that sometimes. I understand that there are restrictions. I think a lot of it came up in COVID, that people felt that suddenly Christians were being targeted. I don't personally feel that was the case. It's not something that I'm going to, die on a hill about. There are definitely Christians that would tell you that in the UK, they are being persecuted. It really comes down to, it may be different in the US, I don't know. But in the UK, it always comes down to free speech. The argument is the persecution comes in the form of restriction of free speech. If that's our definition of persecution, okay, maybe my answer is different. But persecution like we see in what we consider to be the persecuted church, no. In my opinion.
Yep. I think I would share parts of your opinion. You and I have had this conversation before and we don't agree, right? Especially as it relates to COVID. So yes. During COVID time, there were restrictions that were put on churches that I felt was a restriction of not just free speech, but freedom of religion. So freedom of religion is extremely important to me. And when I see Christians being forced to endorse doctrines that they do not believe in, such as homosexual marriage, such as abortion, these things really strike a chord with me. I would not call it the type of persecution that we would see in North Korea, no. But I would see it at the beginning levels and some of the most influential levels. And the reason I put the US, the UK, and the EU in a different categories because traditionally they have been a place where Christians run to and flee when they are looking to escape persecution. And when you start picking away at the pillars of Christian freedom or religious freedom, period, in these nations, then you start picking away at the very fabric that gives people freedom of expression of every religion. So I would much rather be a Muslim in the UK than a Muslim in Iran. I would much rather be a Buddhist in New York than a Buddhist in Tibet. The reason why is that you have individuals that fanatically maintain that you need to follow their religion in a certain way. At least in Christian nations or Christian tradition nations, you have a freedom that you can embrace however you want to follow your own religion. But during COVID, there were churches that were shut down. There were pastors that were targeted. You, Bethany, don't believe that they were targeted because they were pastors. You believe that they were not targeted because they were churches. And you have a very good argument. You make a very substantial...
Is that a question or a statement?
Statement.
You telling me what I believe?
Yes, because we've had this conversation. Am I wrong?
I think you are. What do you think I believe?
I believe that you have said that churches were not targeted just because they were Christian. They were targeted because they were disobeying COVID rules, and that was across the board.
Yes.
Yes. Yes, what? Yes, I was right? Or yes, I was right?
Yes, I agree with what we're still going down this path. And I remember this argument was like 2 hours. Okay. I believe that churches were not targeted because they were churches. I think they were targeted because some churches were breaking COVID restrictions. Now, let me just say, I was not against breaking those restrictions. So I was not somebody that felt like Jesus was on one side or the other of this whole should churches open against COVID restrictions. For me, that was down to the discernment of the pastor and the people, and that's between you and God. For me, I didn't have a strong opinion either way. So it's not that I felt that these churches were wrong for still opening. I didn't feel that they were targeted because they were churches, much like mosques had to shut because they also could not have public gatherings. To me, it was the same across the board. Public gatherings were a no, including churches.
I saw instances where mosques were not shut, grocery stores were not shut. I believe that churches were just as important as food. We saw that with the number of suicides that went up during the time of COVID. That's why I believe that it was absolutely imperative that freedom of religion remain under a circumstance like COVID where people weren't spreading leprosy. Like it was clear, at least I was okay for the first couple of months if people wanted to shut down and those kind of things. But after it was clear that after a couple of months that people were surviving, and now we're still in the same situation as we were in 2020 and everything is open. So it looks like churches were targeted, pastors were arrested during a time where they tried to keep their doors open for their people. You and I disagree on that.
Why do you maintain that it's churches specifically?
Because I believe that there was a focus. Do you remember any focus on mosques that remained open or imams that were arrested?
No, because most of them didn't remain open.
Most of them did not, but some of them did. Most churches did not remain open, but some of them did. It was the pastors in the churches.
I would say that more churches than mosques remain
I
open.
would agree because there's more churches than mosques. So percentage-wise, it might have been the same.
Neither you nor I know that. So
Okay.
Who knows?
So let's move on from here. From here, I would then move into social media, which is a Western-based kind of platforms, plural. During the time of COVID, it wasn't just online COVID misinformation that was targeted, but also Christian messages that were targeted. Even though it's not as extreme as what we would see in a place like North Korea where Christians are killed, the reach of social media is much bigger and it's worldwide. Therefore, because of their impact and global influence, I have an issue with freedom of speech and freedom of religion being trampled on by these Western companies that are doing so with government sanction and in most cases, government support. This is one of the reasons why we started dingdash.com. This is one of the reasons why we launched our own server, because we see this coming persecution as only increasing and Christians being targeted. If Christians weren't the target, I would have no desire to use Christian resources to start a server. That's kind of out of our depth. We're doing it anyway. Starting our own social media site, that's out of our depth, but we're doing it anyway. So we can disagree on that. And they said that under no circumstances is the US or Western countries under persecution. I would say they have an argument there, Stephanie. I would say that they have an argument, and we will not agree, but they can be easily armed with information like Bethany. They can be easily armed with facts like Bethany and come to a conclusion separate from mine. I'm totally fine with that. I see facts leading to a trajectory that's different. That's why I maintain the idea that Christians are being persecuted. It's little, it's small, it's not as intense as in Yemen, it's not as bad as it is in Saudi Arabia, it's not as bad as it is in Somalia, but it's there. It's not on the same scale. And in the US specifically, we see freedom of religion in the US is not even in the top 10 around the world. So the freedom index level for America has dropped tremendously. We've seen the IRS launched against mission groups. We're a part of that. Now, they haven't been launched against us specifically, but I've seen Facebook actually shut down our campaigns. Stephanie, you're running Facebook because I can't even access Facebook. Not only can I not access Back to Jerusalem, which I was able to before, which I started Back to Jerusalem Facebook more than 10 years ago, Facebook blocked me from it, and now Facebook has blocked me from my own Facebook page. I believe that an argument can be made, and I do make one, that it's because of Christianity. Now, Christians being persecuted around the world, this is not even close. We're not even in the same, like, you have to be a moron to think that Christians are not persecuted in other countries. One of the things that I love about the UK is that their House of Commons actually launched an investigation that was supported by the Crown to be able to see what people groups or religions are the most persecuted around the world. They came out with Christianity is the most persecuted in the world, and the British government should take steps in order to protect Christians that are being persecuted. There was a study that came out by the Cato Institute that said that every single year there are every 11 minutes a Christian is being killed for their belief in Jesus Christ. This is something that Christians need to know about. They also need to know that right now there are 360 million Christians living in countries where persecution is significant. 360 million Christians. There's no other religious group in the world that has the kind of persecution that we see against Christians. Mainly because atheists persecute Christians, Muslims persecute Christians, Buddhists persecute Christians, Hindus persecute Christians. Those religious groups are not persecuted in Christian countries, but Christians are persecuted in those countries. Would you agree with that, Bethany?
I'll read one more comment that kind of goes along with this. He says, China has concentration camps and forced labor camps with children in them. They are there because they are Muslim and their parents committed the crime of traveling to a Muslim country, maybe having a Quran in their home, maybe just guilty by association. They imprison whole families to punish their family members. They are forcing Muslim women to marry Han men. They torture people to death in these concentration camps who refuse to recite Communist Party mantras. Full-blown genocide. The Christians seem to be largely left alone in comparison. Maybe it's because Christianity and communism entered China via the same means, in parentheses, European masters. So it has that similar theme of Christians are not being persecuted. So how would you respond to that?
Bull crap. Such bull crap. This is a person that has enough historical references to be dangerously stupid in public. So basically,
let me just say before you answer this, I think this is the example that we were talking about in the beginning, right? Where it's like, it's one thing if someone just kind of comes out the gate and is mean or gets personal or whatever. To me, it's not even worth discussing or engaging with them. But something like this, these kind of comments where it's just simple, pure untruth, I think deserve to be addressed. And I think these are the kind of comments that we were talking about in the beginning, where it's not just about being personal. It's not just about an attack on a ministry. This is somebody putting out completely false information where anyone that knows anything about these subjects would say, what are you talking about?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that we have here is that they have half truths, and then they just end their rant.
This one did. The previous ones did not.
The previous one did not. So the one about the idea of occupying Israel and the Crusades and all of that was just ignorance. This is a type of ignorance that is a bit informed but still lacking quite a bit. And also, may I say, it's a part of this racist kind of mantra that's a bit cool to embrace right now. This European influence. That's why everybody's suffering around the world, and including in China. So, let me first address what they're talking about, mainly in Xinjiang province, the westernmost province of China, where Muslims are being put into concentration camps, re-education camps in mass. It's horrible. It's horrendous. What's happening to people that are Muslims is really bad. But let me also play devil's advocate a little bit, because it is the Muslims that want to separate out of China. They want Xinjiang to be its own province called Eastern Turkmenistan. So they have their own flag, they have a separatist movement, and it's mainly pushed because of the Muslim minority. They're a minority in China, but a majority in Xinjiang. Xinjiang province used to be a part of the Eastern Bloc of Russia that kind of connected. So if you look at Xinjiang on a map, it's connected to Afghanistan, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. It's kind of in that region, right? The people don't look Chinese, they don't speak Chinese, and their background as far as Islam goes back to Islam. And they have been Muslim for about as long as we can see that the Mongols came in, transformed that entire region when they went into Eastern Europe, conquering a lot of Eastern Europe, moving into Western Europe, and running their supply chains from the Mongolian area through China, through modern day Xinjiang, into the war zone of Eastern Europe. So they did that. They conquered so much so fast and then left a trail behind, including in Xinjiang province. So in Xinjiang province, what you have is people that wanted to separate from China. That is very important, because the Chinese do have a problem now. They can't just hold hands and say kumbaya. Xinjiang has more oil and resources than almost any other province in all of China. China's not going to let it go. So if you threaten separation with the largest province of China, basically Xinjiang in China, if you look at the US, China is almost like the US in terms of size, a little bit bigger, but let's imagine the US and China being the same size. For people that can imagine a US map, that's about China. Now, if you think about the Xinjiang province, you're talking about most of Western America. So you have Oregon, Washington, California, Arizona, Nevada, Utah. That's all Xinjiang province. Can you imagine the US letting go of those states? If all of a sudden there was a movement among one particular group of people that said, we want to be separate and we're going to separate from the US would probably take pretty extreme measures. Now, I'm not defending what the Chinese are doing. I'm just saying, let's look at it for a minute from their point of view. The Muslims do not want to be ruled by communists, by atheists. So they have been running operations, military operations against the Chinese. They've been doing bombings, they've been doing attacks, they've been doing airplane hijacking. So the Chinese have had to deal with that. Not just the Muslims in Xinjiang, also the Tibetans in Tibet. What's the difference between the Tibetans, the Muslims, and the Christians? Big difference. The Christians never raised a military unit or tried to do a separatist movement inside of China to take a part of China and make it their own under communist rule. Communist rule has always targeted Christians, always. And they have put Christians in re-education camps for years. Anybody that wants to look at the history of that, you can get first-hand testimony from I Stand With Christ and Kidnapped by a Cult. 2 books that I did directly with 2 pastors inside of China that will tell you about their time in re-education camps, being persecuted by the Communist Party in a way that the Muslims still have not experienced, even in Xinjiang province. But I will concede that they are partially right. The Muslims are experiencing persecution, and they are being identified by their religion because that's how they're being identified. They are Muslims. And they're being taken into re-education camps. Their Qurans are being taken away from them. They are made to quote party lines instead of Quranic surahs. They're being made to marry unbelievers. And let it be said, unbelievers are also being made to marry them. It's called the Sinonization Act of the Chinese Communist Party. They're trying to Sinonize the Muslims. So they are right that the Muslims are being targeted because of religion.
Though, on a more simple level, those things are not mutually exclusive. So just because China is persecuting other groups, it doesn't mean that Christians are also not persecuted. There's no logic in their original argument, even on that basis. Take fact out of it, take information out of it. On that basis alone, your point that, or their point, that other groups are persecuted by the Communist Party does not mean that Christians are not also experiencing persecution.
Yes.
Doesn't make sense.
And this whole idea that, both communism and Christianity are the same kind of colonial movements that came from Western powers into China is absolute BS. You had the colonial powers from the UK that definitely moved in and took over parts of China. They definitely moved to get the Chinese addicted to opium. They definitely used the opium addiction to be able to benefit financially by getting the silk out of the country, starting HSBC, starting the East India Shipping Company. These are massive wealth-inducing movements where colonial powers did take over inside of China. However, when Christians came in as missionaries, they came in, were persecuted, attacked. Many of them lost their families. They served. They started the very first hospitals. They started the very first universities. They started the very first schools for women. They were able to be the very first movements to give freedom to women, education to women, medical attention for women, medical supplies for children, started some of the very first orphanages. Christians served and gave their lives for the betterment of the Chinese. Today, Tsinghua University, as well as some of the top universities in all of China, were started by missionaries. That's a missionary legacy. So take that and shove it, whoever wrote that little remark. And then also, if you look at the #1 hospitals in China today, were legacy organizations started by Christians who came in, served, and gave their lives. One of those such people being Billy Graham's wife's father-in-law, Bell. Nelson Bell. Nelson Bell went in, became a doctor, gave his life to be able to serve for over 20 years as a doctor, giving mainly free medical services to the Chinese people, rescuing babies that were abandoned in ditches because they had some sort of, physical malfunction. And Christian missionaries did that all over serving. That's not colonialism, you bonehead. That's service of Christians that give their lives for the betterment of humanity.
So question, Eugene, if someone like me that doesn't have a full picture of the history of this era, and where would you direct them to go? Because a typical history book that I would have access to, I feel leaves out the majority of what you're saying, and a lot of history that involves, if it makes Islam look bad, is left out. If it typically shines a light on, or doesn't shine a light on, the atrocities, because there's a PC movement of having to be very careful of what you say that is anti-Islamic. If you don't agree with Islam, you're then labeled as Islamophobic. But there are portions of history that I think, from what you're saying, is somewhat left out. So where could we go to read a more well-rounded view of history, or a report on history that maybe doesn't have biases, that really you just want to learn about what happened? Do you have resources that you would direct us to?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you, Stephanie, because it's easy to complain about people being stupid, but not always easy to point them to places where, they can get more information. Some people are they want to confirm their own bias. I'm one of those people. Like, I'm always confirming my bias, right? But like I said, I do like to believe, and I do try to find examples where I'm wrong and argue with myself. I even bring on people like Bethany because she will combat me from time to time. She loses, but she tries, and it's nice. So when it comes to China specifically, I can't really point to one resource. I would say Mao the Untold Story is probably one of the best well-written books. There's another one called Wild Swans. Those two books are great when it shows the atrocities of Atheism on China. If you look at Jesus in Beijing by David Aikman, that's probably one of the best books about the impact of Christianity throughout history, at least recent history inside of China, and the good things that Christianity has done. I would also say The Underground Church by a really great guy by the name of Eugene Bach. I think that that's a great book, as well as China and End Time Prophecies. Little bit, not much. I'm sharing stuff in this podcast you won't find in those books. That's just a collection of information that I've collected over time reading different resources. However, when it comes to Islam, the best book, the easiest I've ever read is called The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam. I'm sorry, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Crusades. PIG, P-I-G. So Politically Incorrect Guide to the Crusades. They have a few of those, these politically incorrect guides. They're easy to read, very factual, very easy to look up, very bullet point oriented, can be read in a short amount of time, and they're fun. They're written in a really fun way. That's the thing about history books, right? Especially if they're written by somebody that is like a historian. They're usually dry, and you want to, stab your eyeballs out with a spoon before you finish the book because it's just so freaking boring. You read all these dates and somebody that was born. It's like reading Leviticus. Like, who wants to read the book of Numbers or Leviticus? It's like, this is the worst book ever. You want to read something with like characters like David and Goliath, or stories, or something like that. So history books aren't easy to read. Politically Incorrect Guide is easy to read. It's not Christian as far as I know. Might even have some strong language in there, but those are the books that I like.
I would also say, because Eugene and I like different kinds of books, more down my alley, the guy who wrote Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus has a lot of information about particularly Muhammad. And the it's such a good job, no one can see you. And the truth about Muhammad. And also he wrote a book called No God But One, which is also along the same lines. So people don't want so much they don't want it to be a history book, but they want more narrative, more story behind it, which is what I prefer. Those two books are great.
Yeah,
Awesome.
Seeking God, Finding Allah, that's like a recent story. How does that tell the story about the rise of Islam or the problems with Islam?
Here's the thing, because you don't read, you don't know, because you haven't read it.
I read that book. I read that book.
No, you haven't.
Yes, I did. I read that book.
When did you read it?
A couple years ago.
Yeah, no, you've never read it.
I did read it. I can tell you. Okay, so the guy in the story actually gives out definitions throughout the entire book. I can remember certain stories, like for instance, one is he can remember an early time in his life when he's riding in the car together with his parents, growing up in America as a Muslim.
Look at you.
Yeah, look at that.
Wow. Okay, so you've read one book in the past 3 years. The thing about this one is, so the whole story, right, is him and his friend David, who's a believer, and they're going back and forth arguing their own religions, right? And the whole kind of book is this back and forth.
Oh yeah, my mind is coming back now. His dad worked for the military, the U.S. military, right? He was from Pakistan.
And on David's side, who's the Christian, he talks an awful lot about the history of particularly Muhammad, and how all that came to be as his argument against Nabil, who says that, he had a very limited view, of course, of Muhammad's life. And so you learn a lot as their arguments are kind of told in the book.
Okay,
That's
fair enough.
a satisfactory answer?
That was. Good job.
Yeah.
Good job.
Thanks.
Good recommendation. Good defending your recommendation. You do read from time to time English, maybe.
I'm impressed you remembered any of it. Good job.
Eugene, be careful. She might leave a mean comment on our Facebook page. Be nice to Bethany.
Thank you.
Okay.
Stephanie.
Oh, you're welcome. We got to stick together, girls, right? Okay,
Stephani's
so
like,
the next
I'm never
one.
doing this again. This is so bad. I'm never doing this again. She's starting to.
I feel I would be sitting in the office, feeling sick, knowing that you were doing this, and I had no idea what you were responding. So I feel better at least supervising.
So
you.
I told her, Bethany. I told Stephanie. I told Bethany today that I was going to do this podcast with you because I didn't put it in the calendar, right? And Bethany always monitors my calendar to make sure that I keep up with the appointments I'm supposed to have. So I didn't put this one in. I'm like, I'm not going to forget it. I'm looking forward to it. She was like, we got to put it in the calendar. And I told her what it was about. And she was like, oh no. And so I begged her, I was like, Bethany, come on, you can come onto the podcast, help be a balance. Because I know I can be a little much. And I can get emotionally invested in some of these, and I can take them personal. And I can also, in my response, be a little bit verbose in a way where I offend people. And I don't want to offend people badly, just enough to wake them up.
Well, here's the thing. If someone comes out swinging, that's how you respond. If someone comes out personal, that's how you respond. So I think that's why. If people came out in a reasonable way, you would always answer them in a reasonable way. But people that come out aggressive, it gets your back up.
Yeah, because it's what Jesus said. Treat people the way you're treated.
Yeah, but Jesus responded with grace and truth.
I just changed some verses there. You should have corrected me.
I was going to say, I don't think he said it quite like that.
I wasn't listening to him. I tune him out every now and then.
Oh, Back to Jerusalem podcast, misquoting Jesus. All right, great. Next.
All right, so yeah, we don't want to do that.
Do you want to do more in this episode, or do you want to do a different episode? Because this is pretty long, right?
Is the next one along the same lines?
So we have a question about what is the punishment for apostasy in Christianity, because it's responding to a bicycle repairman sentenced to death for saying he follows Jesus. Okay. So he was sarcastically quoting Deuteronomy and like two verses in Deuteronomy and a verse in Chronicles that talks about putting to death, I don't know, it's in the Old Testament. And then there's a section of people who have responded to the Voices of the Persecuted Church Conference advertisement. And one is accusing, this one's kind of interesting, accusing those that want to follow him that they're being conned by Brother Yun. And if he is suffering, it's God's will that Brother Yun is suffering. Why is he suffering? What sins is he being held accountable for? Where does he get the money to make these money-raising tours? And he goes on about that. So,
all right, great. Yeah, let's talk all those in the next podcast. I think those are really great. This right here was a great start of answering mail for B2J, people that send questions in or send attacks in. This was, us kind of putting on our waders and answering the haters. That was our beginning of this podcast. And I think on our next podcast of doing a mail call, we're going to be talking about judgment and how does Christianity line up with Islam when it comes to punishment for sins and things done wrong. And what about Brother Yun? Is he a fraud? And those that are working together with Back to Jerusalem, are we just a gang of frauds trying to steal money from people? That will be on our next Back to Jerusalem mail call. Thank you so much for downloading this Back to Jerusalem podcast. I pray that you had as much fun as we did making this podcast. And I pray that somewhere along the line, maybe you were able to learn something, or maybe you disagree with us and would like to put your 2 cents in. Send us an email and let us know your thoughts. We would love to answer your emails in our Back to Jerusalem podcast. Again, I'm Eugene Bach, your host for this time, coming to you live on delay from somewhere within the borders of Sweden. God bless you.